Welcome back, YouTube. Sensei Domino here. This video will be the first VR response I've ever done. This video is for a contest that the Card Closet is doing, where he wants us to show our oldest card in our collection, meaning he wants to know which card has been in our collection the longest. And unfortunately for this contest's sake, not necessarily for my closet space, as a lot of people that have watched videos on my channel know, I stopped collecting in 1999 and didn't pick up card collecting until December of last year. So I went 23 years without collecting. And sometime, I want to say 2016 or so, I cleaned out, I basically went through my card collection and cleaned out anything that didn't look like it was in good shape. And I gave most of that stuff to a good friend of mine's children. I mean, I'm talking like 5 cardboard boxes stacked to the top, full of just beat up, butchered commons. And my oldest card in my collection would have been in one of those boxes, and it would have come out of the 1986 Topps baseball set, because that's really where my focus was when I first started collecting. Because, you know, as a lot of kids, you know, that were 8 years old during that time period, you know, you were asking your mother anytime you went to the grocery store if you could get a pack of cards. And the grocery store down the street, which was a Safeway at the time, only ever seemed to have the 86 Topps baseball rack packs. And so I got quite a few of those. And so my oldest card in my collection probably would have been from there. Aside from that, the oldest one that I can, for the most part, confirm came from that time period would have been one of these two Vince Colemans. The other one I picked up shortly after I got back into the hobby in December. But Vince Coleman was the first player that I actually collected. And it was mostly because that card was probably the most valuable card in the set. And on top of that, what it says on this card, which also probably came from that time frame, is he set in 1985. He set the rookie record for stolen bases with 110, I believe. And so, at one point in time, I must have had 10 or 15 of those Vince Colemans in my collection, and that's probably the oldest card in my collection that I know of. Aside from that, if I go a little bit further, so this video isn't super short, the first card I remember getting was a 1983 Topps Jim McMahon rookie card. And the reason being is I had a friend that lived down the street, at the end of the street, who was a big fan of all the Chicago sports teams, the Chicago Bears, Chicago Cubs, Chicago Blackhawks. And he was really into the Chicago Bears during their 85 Bears Super Bowl run. And he kind of introduced me to some of the players. And I asked my mother for Christmas for a Jim McMahon rookie card. And I ended up getting it as a stocking stuffer. And I think the next card I ended up getting, which would probably have been in the fall of '86, was the Refrigerator Perry 86 Topps rookie card. And I must not have held on to that card very long, because I think a little bit of the I don't know, new car smell of the '86 Super Bowl had worn off by that time, that I didn't really have any sort of connection to those cards anymore. And on top of that, I had gotten heavily into collecting Garbage Pail Kids, and I mean, like a lot of kids my age, that grew up in the mid '80s, and I probably ended up trading those cards for Garbage Pail Kids. But that probably only lasted, a couple months because I think, the new car smell kind of wore off on the Garbage Pail Kids. And, I got out of them pretty fast, a couple months, 2, 3, 4 months. And I ended up starting to get into baseball cards. The guy down the street was collecting baseball cards at the time, and I had another friend that was a year older than me that was collecting baseball cards. And he kind of explained baseball to me because I wasn't very familiar with the game. I was actually asking him, how do I know if I'm getting a good card as I'm going through some 86 Topps cards? And he basically said anybody that has a 300 batting average is probably a good player. Anybody that hits 30 home runs is probably a good player. Anybody that has, I believe, a 3.5 ERA is probably a good player. And I kind of used those, those marks, the statistical marks, to kind of gauge which players that I was getting and which ones are good and which ones aren't, as I learned who the players were. And right around that time, I remember the 86 Topps Traded set came out. And these cards are not from my childhood set. I picked up every single one of these when I got back into the hobby, but this set right here with the Barry Bonds rookie, Bo Jackson, Jose Canseco, Will Clark, Andres Galarraga, Bobby Bonilla, Kevin Mitchell rookies. That set, and I ended up picking up a set of those, and here's a couple of 86 cards. Also, because my grandfather on my dad's side lived in Houston, I heard a lot about the Astros, so I would collect Astros from the 86 set. And so this Harry Spillman is the only one from the base set. All the rest of them are from one of the traded sets that I picked up. And so you got Hal Lanier, Charlie Kerfeld, and then Cubs because of the guy down the street. Here's a Terry Francona and a Gene Michael from the traded set. So those are also from my childhood. And also because the my grandfather on my mother's side lived outside of Boston, Massachusetts, I was learning a lot about the Red Sox, and my grandfather was really big on a guy named Roger Clemens. And here's a couple cards that I picked up when I got back into the collection, a couple of the Clemens rookies. But the oldest Clemens that I still have that I know is from my childhood is this. What is this, 1988? Yeah, 1988 Revco Roger Clemens. All the colors are kind of bleeding all over this card, but I mean, surprisingly in good condition. So I collected Roger Clemens after my Vince Coleman collection got to the point to where I was like, all right, I've got enough of these. Then if I'm talking about vintage cards, actually let me show you these two as well. These are a couple other old cards from my collection, pretty beat up. Here's a 86 Fleer Update Bobby Bonilla rookie and an 87 Topps Barry Bonds rookie. These are both from my early childhood collecting. If I'm talking about vintage cards, I have two stories that I'd like to tell. The first vintage card that I remember picking up, we had a card shop that was 5 miles away from my house, and I was in there one day, and he had sort of a bargain bin, little box sitting right by the cash register. And I remember looking in it, and he had what at the time was the oldest card I had ever seen sitting in there. And it was a 1953 Eddie Matthews with a giant chunk taken out of it. I mean, it's like a quarter-sized chunk taken out of the left corner, completely missing from the card. And I remember looking at it like, wow, this is the oldest card I've ever seen. And the guy at the register actually said, do you like that card? And I say, yeah, it's the oldest card I've ever seen. He said, you know what? Take it. And he ended up giving me a 1953 Eddie Matthews. Unfortunately, I don't know what I did with it. I probably looked at it as like, this is totally beat up, it's not worth anything. And, either traded it off or threw it away, or who knows what I did with it. So I don't have that. The other card that I remember getting early in my childhood is my mother's boss still had his childhood collection from when he was a kid. And he found out that I had gotten into collecting baseball cards. And he sent home with my mother an envelope full of probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 cards. And for the most part, it was a bunch of commons from the 60s. But one of the cards that he did give me, and this isn't the actual copy. I ended up trading it off, but I did replace it when I got back into the hobby back in December. And that's one of these 1962 Orlando Cepedas. And the one that I got was in much worse shape than this. It had creases and rough corners, and I mean, for the most part, on par with what cards from this generation that were well loved looked like. And so that would be the oldest vintage cards I remember ever getting. But if we're talking about the oldest vintage card that's in my collection, and this is debatable whether you would consider it vintage, but I consider it vintage. I consider anything pre-1980 vintage. So here's a really well-loved 1978 O-Pee-Chee record breaker Pete Rose. And this has been in my collection for a long time. It's just very well-loved. So I have that. And then one other card that I remember being very fond of when I first started collecting. This is probably a couple years later, but I know it's from my early collecting. And this is another one of the guys that I prospected without knowing what prospecting meant, is one of these Greg Jeffries. And this is definitely from the early card collecting days. I can tell by the corners. So there's that card. Anyway, hope you enjoyed hearing my card collecting journey. And Card Closet, thank you very much for having this contest, and thank you for watching the video, and I'll talk to you again soon.